Thankfully.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you everyone for coming out this morning, this afternoon, this evening. Um, it's difficult to know exactly what to say in this Disney world of nihilism. But if you're fortunate to have a job, I guess you just have to go ahead and try to do that job. And so I give a lot of thanks and appreciation to my colleagues at the Urban Institute. I want to thank my brothers, Michele Lancioni, for doing the visuals for this lecture, and Edgar Petersa for telling me what to say and not to say. I want to give a special shout out to the Gang of Four, with whom I do my best thinking these days. Gautam Bhan, Teresa Caldera, and Kelly Gillespie. Okay. So most everyone would remember that as children we were warned about some places that were off limits, that we were forbidden to enter. The places were referred to as dangerous neighborhoods, the domains of monsters or unseen or unpredictable forces, places that posed an array of physical or moral dangers. We too, as children, might have attributed particular places as containing a wide range of potential hazards, unbearable uncertainties, places which provoke mixtures of fear and desire, curiosity and repulsion. We might have often just breached the borders of the forbidden, rarely venturing beyond the sight of safety, but intent upon testing the waters, trying to contain an oft irrepressible excitement that lives could be so abruptly altered or taken away altogether. In its simplest version, these places, always at a shifting threshold between the actual and imagined, is what I mean by the surrounds. Usually spatialized as something out or over there, just beyond the town or village, just on the other side of the tracks. We also know that such surrounds could be located at the heart of any inhabitation, a room or a drawer that was off limits. We also know that these spaces were also intensely gendered and racialized. Who could venture where, contingent upon the identities you carried with you? Thus, the surrounds has no specific geography. For our purposes here, the surrounds is not a specific place, but could be. It's not separated out from urban systems, but could be. Is not something beyond control, but could be. Is not a periphery, but could be. It is an ambiguity and uncertainty with no clear resolution, no promise that eventually clarification will be possible. This is not because the surrounds are by nature a space of uncertainty. Rather, because they do surround, they are in a relationship with what we do feel certain about, what we do claim to know, and it is from this vantage point that identification of what populates the surrounds remains elusive. As adults, we often pass through those places of obsessive dread and fascination and wonder what the big deal was. That the forest, neighborhood, cemetery, abandoned building, or industrial zone was not the purveyor of dark forces. That rather, if there were ghosts and other instruments of harm, they could be found anywhere. So it is not as if we never inhabit the surrounds, or that they are fundamentally uninhabitable. Rather, whatever takes place there, whatever is easily recognized, remains unsettled. That there are matters of concern, ways of doing things that simply cannot be settled for sure. So what does this have to do with the consideration from extinction to abolition? We are by now well familiar with the line that crosses these two terms. In a world where an atmosphere of anti-blackness prevails, where certain bodies are arbitrarily expendable and extinguishable simply because they are black and for no other reason, the possibility of sustaining human life as a species remains impossible. For in consolidating a specific version of human life that was possible only through denying the terms of that same life to others who purportedly shared such species classification, it becomes impossible to ground the actions necessary to change our orientation to Earth in any discourse of the human. Anti-Blackness has long operated as the rehearsal for a truncated, partial, and thoroughly normalized rendition of human life that has long institutionalized the acceptance of wasting, of life that can be wasted. If life can be wasted, then so can any other entity that inhabits our world. It is not only that blackness is denigrated, the body taken only as flesh to be rendered commodity or exotic, but that blackness in constituting a near universal surrounds as something that cannot be settled for sure is rendered inert, incapable of being anything more than it is, an eternal errancy which warrants continuous capture. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore has continuously asserted, abolition is about changing everything. It is a movement toward disproportion, beyond calculations of suitable measures. It is about eliminating all possibilities of capture, any notion of a proper place. There are so many scholars whose work far exceeds my capacity to discuss the relationship between extinction and abolition, about how abolition is the only means to restitute the human to a capacity able to rework a sustainable relationship with the earth, that I will leave the details of abolitionist work to others. Certainly the conceptualizations offered here could not have been made without the work of Catherine McKittrick, Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten, Tina Kampt, Zaire Dinsey Flores, Jordana Matlin, Marisol Lebron, Hortense Spillers, Mariam Kaba, Robin Kelly, Kelly Gillespie, David Marriott, and Achille Mbembe. Rather, my work in these lectures is to think how the surrounds remains a generative, though not necessarily clearly virtuous, domain of blackness always coming to life in ways not easily or if ever recognized, and how this surrounds operates as an integral aspect of contemporary urbanization. In other words, as urbanization continues to be informed by anti-blackness, and thus by implications surrounded by a blackness that remains both on the outskirts of normative urban settlement, but yet as an invisible interior, the restless extensivity of urbanization, its seemingly viral spread across all kinds of landscapes, its folding in of disparate ways of living not only connotes an insatiable demand for extraction, but an accelerating sense of being unsettled. Now, the takings never stop, but how the taken land and resources are actually being used, despite all kinds of measures and policing, retains something that cannot be defined for sure. If living as Black requires shifting proportionalities of restraint, indifference, rage, dissimulation, the sheer heterogeneity of such a repertoire of performances signals spaces beyond capture within the present. I want then to talk about the surrounds as those spaces beyond capture, not immune from it, not free of it, but rather something aside it, as a locus of continuous rebellion, a rebellion that might not always look like rebellion, and often bordering on a kind of wretchedness that is nearly impossible to look at directly, that is far from being anywhere near pretty, but which nevertheless enables us to stay focused on seeing something in the now, of making what we have presently available in a. So these lectures are not about specific political tactics or even political critique, but rather disorientations, about living slightly askew. Several years ago, I co-authored a book with my dear friend and long-term comrade, Edgar Peterson, entitled New Urban Worlds. In this book, we attempted to categorize the multiplicity of urbanization processes and dispositions, identify the potentialities and arrangements that might already exist within the cities we inhabit, and address the ways in which existing technical affordances, including that of policy and political mobilizations of urban majorities, might enhance the prospects of provisioning, livelihood, and sustainability. While in some respects the title reflected the wishes of the publisher for a catchy title, we acceded to this by virtue of a sensibility that valorizes the capacities of long occluded Southern urban experiences as a critical epistemology, and to advocate for a more pluriversal orientation to the practices of inhabitation exemplified by urban majorities in Southern latitudes. Perhaps conditioned by the past months, where one could be everywhere and nowhere all at the same time, I want to partially backtrack on this sense of multiple new worlds. Not because I believe that it is impossible to conceive of new versions of humanity, which the notion of the world usually points to, or that we should hold back on the abolitionist imperative to change everything. Rather, my nascent reticence of new urban worlds come from an appreciation of the importance of thinking without narratives of generative relationality, without the conviction that imagines a particular destination and through mobilization and determined planned action works its way toward fruition. This is not because such aspirations and concerted political and technical work are not important. Rather, I want to think through what lurks in the background, what already constitutes the incipient formation of that which we would seem to aspire and work for. Instead of new worlds on the horizon, perhaps we only have this world, if we have any at all. In its specificity, this world doesn't point to anything else. It is not positioned in a process of incessant becoming. While permutations of things and bodies within this world might be inexhaustible, the aberrant, sometimes tenacious repetitiveness of patterns and dispositions that frustrates an increasingly popular intellectual proposition that there is no world, no set of conditions that we inevitably belong to. For that proposition says, if the human simply signals the intertwining of aspiration and the technical affordances that both materialize and motivate aspiration, all of the continuous and accelerating updating of the tools that have shaped the possibilities of self-consideration in history, it should be possible to dispense with the very need for any kind of a world. So why is it this world and not a multiplicity of new worlds? Given that we certainly do not have everything we need, since the necessity of aspiration always undoes the sufficiency of whatever is present, can't an expansive recalibration of archives and artistry eventually catapult us into a different orbital landing, where everything has been remade and just? Why is it that we only have... Of course, the specification of world is crucial. What is being referred to? Especially since world does not line up with earth, planet, society, terroir, metaphysical object, geography, ecosystem, cosmos, humanity, Gaia, or politics. Synapse and all of these in order to convey itself. For the world is the possibility of narration and analogy. All that exists can be translated into new images. The weak will become strong, the strong weak. That some fundamental relationality ties together everything that exists in a shifting terrain of mutual implication, so that the form of relationships that exist now are always being reworked by others, all on our way somewhere where the separation of terms of you and me, us and them, black and white, are finally reconciled in an equilibration of sense and possibility. But when Deleuze indicates that we only have this world, what he seems to be saying is that there are relationships that cannot be analogized, that the world embodies forces so intense and opaque that whatever technical affordances, aspirations, and will we might possess simply is insufficient to retain a relationship with this world that enables a sense of forward action. That is insufficient to generate a story that sustains the mutually enlightened components, be it nature, cities, or cultures. While that which is broken might seem to be the very basis for a hoped-for resolution in a new world, Deleuze sees this brokenness of being without a world, without the possibilities of a progressive, sustained relationship mediated by thought and desire, as very prerequisite for being in the world. Being is something necessarily broken, and as such subject to repair. And repair itself is the relationships. Repair keeps things going, but the repaired is not the same as it was before. For the repair doesn't cure, it doesn't transform or transfix. Repair often borrows parts from elsewhere. It often bypasses problems rather than deals with them directly. Repair may exacerbate certain underlying conditions in attempts to address the symptoms of dysfunction. Once something is broken, it never fully returns to being itself. One often hears that the system is beyond repair, that the society is so broken that only revolutionary change will set things right. And certainly many instances of brokenness cannot be repaired. Repair is not a panacea for all that goes wrong, and repair often intrudes upon the scene, replete with either an excess of good intentions and little skill, or an excess of skill with little long-term imagination. Yet by having only this world, what we have is an arena where each in their brokenness and insufficiency requires the immediacy of a response or engagement that necessitates a decision, an assessment. and often an improvised intervention utilizing whatever is on hand. Although there are certainly planned repairs, as indicated in the signage one sees across many cities, brokenness implies in each instance a sense of temporariness, of the transitory. Brokenness, while in some instances truly signaling the end of things, is also something that need not be inevitable. And while one might have to wait for repairs or tolerate incremental stopgap measures until more comprehensive repairs might be made, what is affirmed is the transitory nature of our relationships within the ambit of this world, a sense of tentativeness and fragility that accompanies any endeavor. We are never at home in this world, not because this world does not provide a home. Certainly we are wrapped up in discursive and material operations that enable us to anchor ourselves in place, to have a perspective or worldview. We certainly are availed the stability of a set of relations that will see us through a development process from childhood to old age. It is not because wherever we find ourselves is already broken, even as this is probably the case. Rather, we are never at home in this world because home itself is a repair of something that always takes place somewhere else. Home is not primarily a place of refuge or socialization or care, but a mobile instrument, always being inserted elsewhere to repair the brokenness of offices, factories, schools, and so forth. Home is that sense that at the end of the day, the primacy of experiencing home as the non-substitutable anchorage of one's relationship to the world will make up for the uncertainties and disparities that characterize relationships elsewhere, that will ward off brokenness even as homes themselves are broken all of the time. Only having this world, however broken our relationship to it might be, Deleuze expresses faithfulness to this relationship because it is something always in need of repair. And as such, we are not captured by this relationship, even if it may be the only one that we might have. In this temporality of transitory functioning, of no guarantees about eventual outcomes, what matters is this time, this instance. What can be done with the tools that one has now? What relations can be configured to access materials and capacities to act expeditiously, to minimize the suffering entailed, and reduce the prospects for long-term damage? This does not mean that a fundamental capacity to aspire is attenuated, in part because the nature of such aspiration is not ours alone. It is embedded within the very technicities that we rely upon in order to reflect upon action. Every instance of a technical system, whether it be simple tools or complex computational machineries, suggests their own prospective courses of action, materialize not only the operations of their current assemblages, but posit in their very design and functioning the basis of unanticipated courses of action and their concomitant social arrangements. Certainly the insurrectional moments that have characterized this past year could not have taken hold or been so widespread without the proliferation of citations, images, synchronous collective actions conveyed through social medias, which function to generate imaginaries and new-scale possibilities of social change. Rather, what I want to emphasize are the ways in which relations to this world are predicated on not only a pre-existent brokenness of coherence and coordination, but the way in which such brokenness, fragmentation, and dispersal usher in practices of repair that provisionally suture together bits and pieces of places into territories of operation, particularly for those volitionally or involuntarily unsettled within the urban regions I have worked in throughout my career. Here, territories of operation simply refer to channels, conduits, passageways, and openings through which life can be enacted in ways beyond capture in oppressive carceral situations, whether it be actual prisons, households, or neighborhoods. Deprived of any essential analogical system that would provide an overarching measure of coherence to the city or region, territories of operation become outcomes of particular itineraries of repair, etching out their own circuit across infrastructures that are often unfinished, detached, ruined, or adamantly still public. Increased numbers of urban residents use the mobility of their bodies, their tactics of spatial immersion, their social contacts, provisional occupations, and feigned uselessness to connect discrepant spaces of the city to each other's sites of temporary dwelling. Domains of exchange and reciprocal who use these things, contact, occupations, and feigned useless, use them to connect different spaces of the city to each other and create domains of exchange and reciprocal care. Just as important as repair might be to the viability of everyday life, there are also times where it is important to leave what seems broken alone, untouched in that it potentially offers new premises for action. Like my friend Laura Kemmer is fond of saying, to look at trees that emerge from broken sidewalks, or the nocturnal solitude offered by a wrecked car on the side of the road. While brokenness is an incitement to repair, a reiteration of the viability of this world, brokenness also can suggest its own courses of action without us necessarily always being lured into doing something about it. This process of making territories of operation, in many respects, is completely logistical, in that it is configured to facilitate the movement of things with minimal impediment, even if the thing is simply the body of the residents themselves. While these territories of operation may not be readily consolidated or stabilized, in that the fundamental relations of inhabitation, questions of citizenship and racialization remain broken, they constitute a locus of efficacy and self-valorization that places many residents in touch with each other that previously had no platform of touch. What an accruing archive of itineraries in aggregate actually does in terms of effectively altering the structure of power within urban life is difficult to measure, and certainly doesn't obviate the need for more visible and, if you will, standardized formats of political mobilization. But whether these mobilizations themselves are possible may be contingent upon new vectors of movement and interchange that temporarily exceed the fantasies of different regimes to fix the city once and for all. It goes beyond the image of absolute logistical efficiency, where everything is in its place through a system of calculation, transport, and tracking capable of taking everything out of their place. What is particularly salient to this discussion is the degree to which many residents are on the move, living through these improvised itineraries. They certainly cannot go anywhere they want. They are certainly restricted to spaces that are alternately depleted, underdeveloped, failed, or replete with generic or racialized built environments. But at the same time, this movement is a deferral of resolution. Residents may still profess a desire for our house with 2 cats in the yard, but in actuality are wary of settling anywhere too prematurely, even if they have the means to do so. In many cities of the South, the continuously reworked contours of the metropolitan state assumes new intricacies across what Neferti Tadayar has called the cash rewards, kickbacks, rents, protection money, promotion logics of police political machines. Although the methods vary from one urban region to another, from the use of religious dogma to drug eradication to terrorist control, the very intimacies of social life are targeted in such a way as to foster increasing levels of distrust among neighbors and defensive maneuvers that attempt to exercise control over how a household or individual is to be known. A concordance of policing strategies, the profusion of media messages about individual success and responsibility, the voluminous demands on neighborhood life and infrastructures that increase the labor intensity of everyday management, and a general undermining of platforms for public deliberation, all contribute to an intensifying individuation of the practices of urban residency. Additionally, this is accompanied by an amplified sense of mattering, where a more proficient and detailed assessment of the behavior of residents, their practices and aspirations come to matter for how they are to be governed and enrolled in various trajectories of development. Determinations about eligibility in terms of access to benefits, rights, spaces of operation and residence, provisioning, investment, become increasingly critical. No matter the background, residents increasingly matter in terms of what might be extracted from them, even if it simply entails the probabilities of them acting in particular ways within a wide range of different scenarios. At the same time, the individual decisions, dilemmas, and actions of individuals and households increasingly matter for residents themselves, as the implications for failure and wrong moves might have dire, even irreversible implications. This is particularly the case for households that have been availed expanding consumption driven through taking on debt. The reluctance then of circulating residents to settle down, to apply limited resources to consolidating new place for themselves in place, even as they are often being forcibly resettled, reflects not only a hedging on a broad toolbox of actions in a context where they report difficulties in assessing where the city is going and what will be required of them. It also reflects an approach to urban life that concedes its brokenness, broken in terms of any overarching sense of connection amongst its different sectors and places, broken in terms of any overarching sense of connections among its different sectors and places, broken in terms of what they might have aspired to in terms of an incremental progression toward a good life, and broken in terms of the willingness and capacity of those who govern to provide either a persuasive imaginary of a well-functioning city or the technical and political competence to deliver the basics of urban provisioning. In conceding the brokenness, the incentive to repair not only draws upon long-honed practices of ensuring the infrastructural and social endurance of specific neighborhoods, it also elaborates repair as everyday practices of reconnecting their relationship with the urban world, a world that is not conceived as new or necessarily multiple, but the only world that they have. Repair, again, concerns the quilting of fragments, the lines residents draw among different hostels, boarding rooms, sweatshops, junkyards, vacated warehouses, underpopulated industrial zones, vast swathes of affordable single-family housing, and massive apartment blocks. While bodies are indeed moved around, it would be a mistake to say that large numbers of residents are being expelled from the city, for the city stretches along uncertain trajectories and hybrid recomposition that, although distant from the cores, distant from the high-value generating zones of accumulation, nevertheless constitutes a staging area for actions at the moment nebulous, in part because the terrain itself is nebulous. I want to think through these spaces of simultaneous fugitivity, displacement, targeted extraction, and recomposition as the urban surrounds. These surrounds are not necessarily placed in the peripheries or hinterlands of urban regions, even though these sites perhaps provide the most opportune site from which to think about and engage them. For they also include zones within the urban core that implicitly or intentionally refuse incorporation into the predominant logics of accumulation or the circuits of extraction. Still, their physical proximity to the centers of accumulation, urban renewal, spectacularization, and speculation mean that they are often deeply recessed into the interstices separating out different infrastructures, in between parking garages, ports, railheads, in the back lots and vague spaces between megatowers. The surrounds have no essential integrity of form or functioning. At times, they are spaces in waiting, spaces of storage, of the warehousing of devalued populations. At times, they are the spaces where the curve of ascendancy has been flattened for a prolonged period of time, where residents are stuck with non-fungible assets, or in locations repeatedly vulnerable to flooding or conflict. The surrounds can even encompass those anachronistic domains of power and administration that no longer function according to their constitutional principles, where authority, privilege, and money have moved on, thus leaving vacuous bureaucracies in their wake that either become living mausoleums or the vectors of a multiplicity of arrangements where documents, approvals, stamps, permissions, licenses are issued for a cut of the action. The surrounds is by definition unruly, unsettled, provisional, unspecified. There are two particular notions I have in mind in this sense of the surrounds. These notions are not intended to displace the critical observations that have been made by those working on processes of extended urbanization in the years since this notion was issued by Lefebvre. Particularly important is his sense of how urbanization extends itself beyond the operations and arrangements that initially consolidated its specific forms, and where urbanization became its own driving impetus, not as a coherent set of economic and political processes, but rather as an axiomatic capable of generating a plethora of novel dispositions, even if their viability entails the production of surplus value. Here the work of Christian Schmidt, Neil Brenner, Roger Kyle, Roberto Montemor, Mia Irawati, Tanya Chandra, Stephen Cairns, Nitin Bhatla, Matt Gurney, and Rodrigo Castriota has been particularly valuable. But having referenced these more strictly geographical interventions, I want to refer to notions that concur with the sense of the surrounds as not this but could be, where its nature is not captured in any specific manifestation, but which nevertheless can manifest itself in forms and situations that do not inherently belong to it. The work of Frédéric Neurath might provide some useful scaffolding to this notion of the surrounds. In his critique of so-called geoconstructivism, Neurath warns about orientations that continuously affirm infinite and immanent generativity. By this he means the endless capacity for becoming that informs the conceit of a wide range of actors who believe that the earth can be terraformed, made available to numerous ameliorative interventions that might ensure the ongoingness of the earth as a viable place for humans. These humans are now aggregated as a univocal species. Prior differentiation can no longer be afforded in the need to recalibrate new relationships with nature. Nature, which has largely been a phantasmic construction of humans. In both the conceptualization of nature as something intrinsically removed from society, or as something intrinsically a part of and unfolding of everything, nature is available to be acted upon for better or worse. But for Neurath, nature is neither a figment of our imagination, nor an all-encompassing unity. Nature is rather what he calls a trajet, a long-term event of unfolding differentiation, concretized in different forms at different times. What is important here is not just the becoming, but that becoming itself is contingent upon separation, constraint, withdrawal, something that is recessed from view, not apparent or traceable, that which permits rhythm, a declension, a gap, pause, empty space in syncopated time. Not dissimilarly, if the urban is the site of endless productivity, a compulsion to remake, refine, recalibrate, then it can never really emplace, put down roots, or anchor. Rather, urbanity is an event generating all kinds of untoward implications. These implications don't necessarily move toward anything in particular. They don't necessarily produce something clearly functional, useful, or continuous. Neurath calls this the unconstructible, a universal reserve of disconnection, without which differences could not exist. So these are gaps in the narratives that articulate and refigure various manifestations of the urban into specific relationships. So production is not only generative, but dissipative, as the entwining of colonial and climate histories clearly demonstrate. And production increasingly obscures the elements and processes of making, so that it is not apparent what actually exists or how to relate to it. As such, anti-production maneuvers are required to interrogate how particular things appeared, how they got there and acquired the status they did. This is a maneuver that goes beyond the simple affirmation of identifying the positionalities of something within an endless meshwork of relationships that would demonstrate the ways in which everything is available to each other. Rather, anti-production entails the ways in which human and inhuman participants compose an environment that render each other accessible to the other, laying out together the manner in which they and the environment come to exist. Otherwise, if I simply say that I am inextricably linked to you, then acting on you is as if I'm acting on me, something to which I'm entitled by the exigency of my survival. You thus become accessible to me without a mutual deliberation on the terms of that access, something which reiterates the basic tropes of the colonial and undermines your access to this world. Instead, for difference that means something concretely in terms of an economy of affordances and mutual action might require the space or modality of what Brigitte Kunster calls becoming everyone. This is a process of becoming no one in particular, a generic disidentification where plenitude is held in compressed form so that it becomes momentarily unclear what the proportions otherwise are to be apportioned and distributed according to eligibility and value actually are. So this sense of one knows that there are many different things operating and functioning within this kind of becoming, but it's impossible to tell what the proportions of what any of them are at work. So in some ways they are in a sense free to interact in ways that are beyond our sense of apportioning specific value to them. For if access to each other can repeat the colonial situation of extraction and theft, there needs then to be spaces of inaccessibility. When the surrounds are temporarily concretized in certain environments at the urban hinterlands, it is exactly accessibility that is being unconstructed. In the mushrooming Jakarta landscapes of warehouses, cheap single-family 40-square-meter pavilions, mega apartment complexes, upscale gated communities, industrial parks, migrant hostels, and shophouse-style commercial zones, it is clear that a vast urban expansion is taking place, a blanketing of different modes of settlement. We can see it, we know it, we can measure it. At the same time, an equally vast vacancy endures, as these projects are never really ever fully completed, or if they are completed, they're never fully used, occupied. It doesn't mean that at some point they won't be, or that they can't be, or that they won't be repurposed or torn down for other projects. Just at the moment, within the present, they remain unavailable for any accounting for sure, any definitive judgment of their efficacy. Additionally, this enduring emptiness for now also troubles the conditions of those who do occupy and remain. It raises questions about their own aspirations and agendas, their own perceptions of the meanings of the spaces they navigate, and what is workable and permissible or not, often cultivating highly idiosyncratic responses. In some local town councils, unofficial rules are tightened, local surveillance measures intensified. Yet in other councils, they are simply let go, as residents become indifferent to everyday comportment, household compositions, and activities. Sometimes these contrasting orientations leave each other alone. At other times and circumstances, new accommodations and differences emerge that allow for new uses to be made of underutilized commercial, residential, or industrial spaces in a series of trade-offs or bartering. Here, where goods and services are revalued in terms of their support for experimental ventures, providing new objects of governance for local administrations concerned that they are being hemmed in by context-insensitive protocols. So the surrounds are not one thing, neither always transparent nor opaque, neither always generative nor withheld. They are the grounds for a more thorough and judicious accounting of the manner in which beings and things are available to each other, and at times the impossibility of any kind of assessment. They are the trajectory of the urban, not as a self-replicating fractalized machine that simply repeats the same formula as the means of extending space and extending itself across it. Rather, the urban is also that which breaks open, pauses, compresses. All of these maneuvers unproductive in any strict sense, but worthy in terms of what Michael Fisher calls temporality of in the meantime. To elaborate on this meantime, I draw upon the project of J. Cameron Carter and Sarah Jane Chervenak at Duke University, who, following the injunction of Saidiya Hartman to always imagine an outside while being inside, to make one's way into the out, assembled a group of leading American Black scholars to consider the ways in which Black living points to the possibilities of a space within this world beyond enclosure, property, and self-possession. What are the legacies and potentials of Black study that enable the specification of practices operating outside sovereignty, specification, measurement, and capitalist valuation that can be experienced within the enclosures of racial capital? The conundrum here is that these outdoors are only apprehendable as broken, since the discernible and conclusive rendering of the outside as the normative inside is yet to come. As broken, they are necessarily partial but reparable. But they are reparable only in the terms of not restoring them to health, as such a practice would inevitably be informed by the cures issued by an inside. Nevertheless, such repair is directed toward maintaining the endurance of an outdoors, recognizing that brokenness cannot be fixed within the master's domain or within his terms, but how yet such brokenness is the very means of establishing a relationship with this world from an outside, from a relationship to it that is broken. This is not a place of fundamental negativity, antagonism, or contradiction, but a position that enables one to regard this world as already an outdoors. This position does not affirm brokenness as the inevitable enduring condition of this world. Rather, it is the starting point of a reorientation able to resist any settlement on offer, any formula of reconciliation, any proposition that offers a way out or a renewed relationship that does not prioritize the active appropriation of the broken as the very material to constitute a form of totality. Because such a totality remains situated within the racialized apparatuses of spatial control, it must configure its own strange visibilities, recognized as neither this nor that. The second notion I want to invoke is the Islamic notion of balad al-siba, a space that is not addressable in any available vernacular, a space of disorder and illegitimacy, unsettled and disconnected, and finally a practice of living at the enemy's expense. These multiple connotations do not suggest a space prohibitive of inhabitation or use, but rather the need for transience, momentary renditions of what is made available into the image of a settled territory, but at the same time unruly. As unruly, this space is not as much interested in perpetuating itself, but rather acting as a platform for moving on, repositioning everyone entailed in these arrangements in new neighborhoods of affiliation and collective action. Questions of rendering have long been at the heart of so-called peripheral worlds, the constantly shifting assemblages of we amongst people with tentative anchorage in the familiar tropes of kinship, ethnicity, territory. Here, the athanal is based not on reciprocal exchange or common belonging, but on raiding, stealth, exorbitant displays, transgressive expenditure, simulation, strange alliances, and transmutations with spirits, ghosts, and jinn. If all broken relationships require some kind of mediation, some kind of brokerage and bargains, then for peripheral Muslim worlds, jinn have long been critical intermediaries, breaking and repairing and breaking again, so that dispensations are not settled for sure, so that hierarchies are dissolved only to be refigured again and broken. For jinn are the interlocutors or the hinges of territories that intersect spirit bargains, money transfers, remembrances of saints, re-equipped 4x4s, collective traumas, navigational circuits, and practices of hospitality. Today, the Sahel-Saharan regions, long associated with Bilad al-Siba, today struggle to piece together viable territories of operation capable of compensating for the paucity of state investments. This is due in part to the residues of colonial attributions that saw Sahelian populations as those without control, limited statehood, and the compression of herding and farming on shrinking volumes of arable land. This is an intensely heterogeneous population, more or less Muslim, more or less anchored in discernible national identities, more or less Black, and so forth. Within an expanding regime of surveillance, plentiful guns, thousands of religious institutions and sentiments, oscillating currents of flows of narcotics, cigarettes, and pharmaceuticals, shifting porosities within national borders, internecine conflicts amongst ethnic groups, expressing divergent means for realizing common aspirations, and interventions of foreign forces. Constellations of actors attempt to instantiate themselves across often highly differentiated communities. They do this as a way of providing protection, securing a base for trafficking, curating interdependencies among diverse local authorities, and aligning themselves with widely known antagonists, such as an array of jihadi groupings, in order to institute mechanisms of accumulation and distribution. Widely misrepresented as conflicts among different global Islamic mafias, such as Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, these constellations, more or less associated with specific ethnic groups, not only attempt to enhance their capacities for circulation, but themselves circulate amongst different organizational formats and alliances, whichever is best situated in terms of giving voice to a panoply of opportunities to become local service providers. There is a recognition that all opportunities are transitory. Thus, while profits accruing to largely Tlemcen Arabs in northern Mali through the transshipment of cocaine from Guinea and Guinea-Bissau to Algeria and Libya were enormous, there was always a sense that it wouldn't last, as the technical apparatuses needed for this economy, vehicles, routes, drivers, protection, weapons, payoffs, laundering, would always suggest alternative assemblages that they would not be able to control. So they always hedged their investments across different registers of products, affiliations, and identifications. What was important was to render the appearance of a well-ordered machine for the time being, insufficient in and of itself for a prolonged duration, but providing adequate cover in the medium term to test the waters in other domains, as well as to prop up those economies to which a particular group was long associated, even if for only symbolic reasons. Within these two notions, then, of the Black outdoors and Bilad al-Siba, I suggest the surrounds as an ever-shifting domain of possibility that doesn't exist simply by looking at the urban in a different way, even though such a process can be useful, but rather through an enactment of circulation, repeated and recalibrated as itineraries. These itineraries render specific spaces, apprehended as fundamentally broken, the materials for provisional sutures, so as constitute territories of operation in the interstices between ever-shifting technologies of spatial control and capacity of the settled to undo, as Saidiya Hartman puts it, the very parameters of recognition that otherwise divide the worthy and unworthy, the obedient and the wayward, the lost and the found. The surrounds are what residents do, rather than a reference to something that is there, although what is there is rendered useful to a point. For example, the models of urban development tend to err in favor of upward projections, the ability of each new development to handle potential demand, to avoid price inflation based on scarcity, and to manage possible multiplier effects that are the outcome of the intensified urbanization of spaces. Part of the ability of developers to raise the necessary finance for projects is to represent bigger and better than they have a reasonable chance of becoming. In financing schemes, they have to cover debt accrued for past project development. The terms of new projects have to be inflated accordingly, so that new projects are sometimes conceived as an instrument to more firmly consolidate the asset class of those past. As a result, and at different scales, urban landscapes are increasingly carpeted with underutilized projects and built environments that often become way stations of many kinds of temporary use. As populations are pushed out away from places of employment, many residents holding on in more proximate locations convert a portion of the spaces they have access to very cheap rental accommodation so that others might save on transportation costs. Households are sometimes distributed across multiple temporary locations in order to cover a wider terrain of potential opportunity, as groups of other tenuously connected persons forge roving bands of extended families that move in concert, but not physically together, across both agreed upon improvised circuits, encompassing a wide range of satellite towns where things in general may be much less regulated. Here, conventional modes of settlement are undone, while the attentional spans of related individuals are extended across a variegated terrain. Let me offer a small example. Rahman is part of a comunitas in Jonggol, in the eastern hinterlands of Jakarta, a large expanse of residential, commercial, industrial zones that somehow has never completely shed its feel, and whose subsequent spaciousness descriptive in terms of demographic density and economic operation. The comunitas, to use a popular Indonesian term, simply refers to any form of self-organized collectivity, which in most instances remains largely informal, like an extended network of friends or associates who view themselves as tied together in some kind of purpose. Here it is a crew of 30-somethings, some 40 individuals who have in common only that they attended elementary school in the Javanese city of Sukabumi at the same time. Some of them have found work in food processing plants in Jogol, working drug-fueled 14-hour shifts and sharing single rooms in migrant hostels. When jobs could not be found in the factory, some took up positions at food sellers near the factory gates, or drove motorcycle taxis at ferry workers in their attempts to find less oppressive employment elsewhere. Some took jobs as domestics in the households of factory managers, and others at small repair shops or cell phone outlets. For what's up, they checked in with each other throughout the day, giving information about where to find cheap goods, how to make money on the side, where to find the best affordable health care, where local political and religious meetings were being held that offered free food packages and opportunities for the group to perform collective dissimulations about some gang, some constituency. Over the years, their residencies, employment, and activities have spread across the expanding jungle, where they have become low-level suppliers for surplus goods needed in construction projects, caterers for weddings, promoters of hip-hop events, brokers for local politicians, redrawing lines of connections among a wide range of activities and locations. One of their crew, Undy, dropped a small bus they purchased to ferry the growing number of offspring to a small school they've established in a vacated office block. Everything they have done over the years was treated as accompaniments to each other, and each person was themselves viewed as an accompaniment to lives that were still largely led on an individual basis, but availed their own surrounds. Constant challenges to rethink what might go together, how different places and activities might touch upon the other without tying each other down. This refusal to be tied down has long been the ethos of traders from Fouta Djallon in Guinea. "We will only discover each other a long way from here," was a common refrain among neighbors. "At home, we are surrounded by our enemies. Over there, beyond what we know, we make everyone our friends," was another popular saying. As longtime friend and collaborator Amadou Diallo remarked a few days before Guinean President Sékou Touré's death in 1984, African cities were hinges, their primary purpose to set different angles of opening and closure. As hinges, they had no intrinsic identity themselves, but rather were modulations of light and darkness, focusing alternating perspectives on things, at times widening exposures to some great outdoors, at other times narrowing the gaze, withdrawing observers inward. Diallo started his career when he was 10 years old, selling loose cigarettes in the Chicago neighborhood of Conakry. Once a bastion of loyalty to the Pan-African dreams of Touré, nevertheless, the district bore the brunt of his paranoia, fed by psychotic mystics from Labé. It was from this mountain town of Labé that Diallo had moved to the Guinean capital when he was 2 years old. Mountains that supplied factory workers in Nanterre, taxi drivers in the Bronx, bankers in Dakar, and gem dealers in Brazzaville. For Diallo, hinges were the essential technical feature of thresholds that had to be marked among multiple belongings and realities. It permitted differentiated degrees of access, in turn mediating everyday decisions as to what and where one should be. He was always fond of saying, "Africa is not something you bring home or take with you. It's not something to believe in or to recognize as you move around. It is only a door never completely open or closed." By this he meant that Africa was literally an outlook, a shifting vantage point from and through which to engage the world, something that could be narrowed down to microscopic visibility or widened to take everything in without discrimination or discretion. As such, the Pan-African dreams that were the stuff of daily tutelage throughout Diallo's primary and secondary education were not those of some united polity eviscerating colonial borders, nor of some consolidation of Black peoples dispersed across seas, but something much simpler yet elusive, dreams of spreading out, being more or less this or that, of occupying different versions of oneself to audiences that would never be the same twice. Dreams were those of a life beyond capture, for even as many African societies had been based on the prospects of seizing or being seized, of being captivated by different streams of thought, the ethos of the Fouta was essentially never give anything away. One can be dispossessed, charitable, or sacrifice anything, but never show all of your cards. Younger and thoroughly urbanized Fulbe people from the Fouta will often now complain that their elders never told them anything, never shared the essential secrets or wisdom. always invoking that what they needed to know was right in front of them, if only they could see it, if only they altered the angle in which they looked at things. Here again, the hinge points to questions of access, touching upon the preoccupations of many African societies with the politics of exposure, of modulating just how much of the world can be let in at any given time, and what has to remain closed off. In the ethos of the Futa, of Islam in the Futa, every person is inscribed in and by a specific project that can only be realized through warding off constant attempts by others to extract from it, to dilute or distort it. Thus, what one performs in all of the different versions of oneself that can be dissimulated on the basis of everything the project is not, is a constantly moving hinge that never stabilizes the line of sight or exposure. The life project itself thus functions as a surround, purpose, yet is constantly elusive to external scrutiny and thus judgment. It reserves the right of judgment to no one but Allah, while marking a path where no one is expendable, for each project demands its witnesses, an egalitarian assembly where no one is in a position of more privilege than anyone else, since everyone doesn't know your project any better than anyone else. So in a twist of W.E. Du Bois' notion of the veil being the demarcation between white and black life lived in the same city or country, here within the West African Islamic ethos, the public persona is itself a veil, driven by the contents of a project that remains inaccessible to all potential viewers, that only manages to realize itself indirectly, that never culminates in a single state or cultural imagination, that expresses its fate without capture. Thank you very much.